Here we are at the second half of page 97. So the directions say use the number line. Write whether each fraction is closer to 0, closer to half, or closer to 1. So then it gives you a reference here as a number line to show you what that means. 0, half, and 1. So notice half is halfway between 0 and 1. However, the problem that you might run into is that the rest of the fractions that it gives you are actually not given on a number line. Unless you're very good at imagining fractions, I would highly recommend that you draw a number line for every single one of these. That will help you to see, is it closer to half, 0, or 1. However, that being said, notice that 7, 8, 9, and 10 all have a denominator of 8, which means you could put them all on the same number line. In fact, a number line just like this. You could do those 4 problems right here on this number line and get the correct answer. We'll work with this more in a second, but first of all, I want us to understand more about what half and whole and 0 mean and how the rest of the fractions relate, especially to 1/2. So here I have my reference point again, the whole, that's how big that is, and you can see how big the half is as well. Notice again that 1/2 is 2 pieces, so you divide this whole into 2 pieces, which is why the denominator is 2, and then taking one of them would give you 1/2. Then let's compare the third fractions to that. Notice that there is no amount of pieces I can line up against 1/2 and get the exact same size as 1/2. So thirds, it's either going to be greater than half or less than half, and you'd be able to tell, is it closer to 0 or closer to half or closer to 1? So I'm going to start with 1/3. Notice that it's smaller than a half, but since it's over here, it's just a little bit closer to half than it is to 0. If I were to make the fraction 2/3, now I can see it's definitely greater than half, but it's still, if I zoom up here closely, you can see it's still closer to half, this halfway point here, than it is closer to 1/2. So that's the way I would think of that fraction. Then, if I were to move these out of the way, you can see actually that the fourths do have a fraction that's exactly the same size as 1/2. If I were to line up 2 fourths, that will be the same length or the same distance along the number line as 1/2. That's very helpful. We'll talk about that more later. Then if I were to have 3 fourths, this is going to be a tricky one, and this one's not in your workbook, thankfully, because this is exactly between halfway and 1/2. So it's right between half and whole. So you wouldn't be able to say whether it's closer to half or whole, it's exactly halfway between. So keep that in mind as well, but your workbook won't trick you like that. When I get into fifths, and you'll see I have another half just put down here for a reference point so I can see that better. And I'll hold this carefully so you can see the comparison. Once again, this is half, and then if we were to start with 1/5, I'll move some of these over. You can see now at this point, 1/5 is closer to 0 than it would be to 1/2. As soon as I put a second fifth there, and make sure these are lined up carefully here, it's actually now closer to 1/2 than it would be to 0. As soon as I put another fifth there, it's now greater than a half. So now I have 3/5 comparing to 1/2, but it's still closer to a half than it would be to 1 over here. As soon as I put 4/5 and compare that, and zooming out again so you can compare it to 1 a little bit better, notice now it's closer to 1/2 than it is closer to a half. Then, like we talked about in the last video, if I put all 5/5 here, now that's exactly the same thing as 1/2. Sorry, as 1/2. Then I'll move down to sixths, which are right next to it, so it's easy to compare. Notice right away that there is a certain number of 6 that line up exactly with 1/2. That's going to be very important later. So we see 1, 2, 3/6 is the same thing as 1/2. So it also won't ask you about 3/6 in your workbook because it's exactly 1/2. It's not closer or farther away to 0, half, or whole. but this is good to know anyway. So then if we start with 2/6, this time we take 2 pieces of the 1/6, we can see this is just a little bit closer to half than it is to 0. So if you had this problem, it gives you the fraction 2/6. In this case, you'd have to say it's closer to half. You would not write closer to 0. If we go to 4/6, and I'll put all my 6 down so you can also see what 1/2 looks like, but then kind of covering these up a little so you can see this is what we're talking about for now. 4/6, if I take 4 of those pieces, is still a little bit closer to half than it would be to 1/2. As soon as I have 5/6, then I can see I'm a little bit closer to 1/2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's still a little bit closer to 1/2, closer to over here. Then once again, as soon as I have 6 pieces of 1/6, I now have exactly 1/2. Same thing goes down here, so I won't repeat the whole process, but notice again these numbers that are exactly the same as 1/2. I have 4 pieces of 1/8, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I have 5 pieces of 1/10. So that means the fraction 4/8 is the exact same thing as 1/2, and that the fraction 5/10 is the exact same thing as 1/2. Last one, we can see again there's another perfect comparison to 1/2 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now I have 6/12 that are the exact same thing as 1/2. So now moving back to my number line here, I'll try a couple different ones since your book uses eighths quite a bit. We'll write a note here that 1/2, this is the exactly halfway point at 4/8 right here. So we'll keep that in our minds. And then I'll put a star by some that we're going to think about. So let's think about 1/8 first. So now that we're just using a number line and not fraction strips, I can still see, oh, this is quite a bit closer to 0 than it would be to 1/2 or to 1/2. So for the answer to this one, if it tells me the fraction is 1/8, I'm going to write closer to 0. Then if I have the fraction 3/8, I can almost right away see it's closer to half than it is to 0 or 1. So I'd write closer to 1/2. If I have the fraction here, asks me, what about 7/8? I can see right away it's closer to 1/2 or 8/8 than it is to half or 0. So just so this makes sense here, we can write a 1 again in bold if we need to remind ourselves 8/8 is the same thing as 1. 0/8 here is the exact same thing as 0. I'll write that big and bold to remember. Those are our reference points. So once again, the number line goes from 0 to 1. Half is exactly in the middle, and we compare different fractions to see what they're closest to. So with that information, I think you should be able to do the rest of page 97.
Make sure to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and see you next time on 4th grade math lesson.